Hello, and welcome to the Nauticast podcast, the one true chapter by chapter podcast going through a Song of Ice and Fire one chapter a week. I'm one of your hosts, Jeff, better known as Brendan Beefish.
And I'm your other host, Emmett, better known as Poor Quentin.
And welcome to the 154th episode of the Nauticast titled Father and Son, an analysis of A Storm of Swords, Tyrion 1, in which Tyrion Lannister has a real heart-to-heart with Dad, which results in them throwing that old pigskin around for a bit. It's a real heartwarmer, this chapter, isn't it, Emmett?
I am enjoying your alternate universe, like Kevin Costner version of Storm of Swords that we've been leading every chapter with. Like the Field of Dreams version of Storm of Swords where the families are getting along and there's like a wistful Neil Young song going on in the background. I love this version of Storm of Swords. Alas, here we are with the real one.
Alas, I mean, I think this is just gonna be a trend. We're just gonna continue. Like next week for Davos, he's going to be like sunning himself at the beach. Yeah,
right. He needs a little vacation. Am I right, folks? This was well deserved.
And he chose a tropical island on Blackwater Bay to vacation at. So definitely going to continue with this going forward. So as always, this episode is brought to you by our not a small council. Our Hand of the King, Wolfman Zach, Grand Maester Timbob, troubleshooter of systems and designer of circuit boards, Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, Mark N, Sir Keith J, Master Whisperers, Lord Philip the Merciful, Master of Laws, Archmaester June, Healer of the Lesser Poxes, Ragged Michael, Ward of the North, Nelson Hammer, Prince of Dragonscone, Scarlet the Other Woman and Mistress of Whisperers, Lord Micah, the Quilled Lion, War of the West, Herald the Golden Tooth, Master of the Banefort, and the Kraken's Bane, Lord James, the gem that was promised, Lord Jake assisted to the Head of the King, Lady Zena Valyrian, Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dane and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, His Grace's High Inquisitor, Sir Frank B., Lawrence, Prince of Dorne, Kelly, War of the East Bishops of Old Bay of Crabs, Stephen the Steadfast, Master of Hounds, the Blue Winter Rose, Knight of Highgarden, Lady Stephanie, Lord Carlos, Lord Andrew the Restless, a priest of the Drowned God, Sir Sorcedelica, Sugar Tit Stent, the Troglodyte Warrior, Lord Penchant for Nostalgia, Queer Alex, Beyonce's favorite stand, Herald of Cher and Bastard Chromatica, Exalter of Black Lives and Defender of Trans Lives, Rainbow Commander of the Ladies and Gentledoms of and the Nauticast non-binary, not an army. Oliver the Way for T-Well, A.A. Ron Dampere, Prophet of the Forsaken and High Priest of Euron Crowseye, Lieutenant Glenn, Lord of H-Town, Veneris of House Golgarian, the First of her name, Princess of Dragonstone, Mistress of Art, the Abort, Queen of the Pencils, the Eraser in the First Draft, Queen of Monochrome, Devotee the Great, Game of Thrones, Portions of the Realm, Lady Realist of the Seven Kingdoms, Leonard Paints, Maker of Drawings, and the Michelangelo of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Lord Adam T, Lady Alexander of Tarth, Sir Christoph Logus, Bloody Scorpion of the Redfield, Defender of the Letter of Kin, and the Wolverine of House Corgoyle, Lady Elizabeth, Mistress of Horse, Face, Lesbians, Sir Josh Snow, Bastard Bounty Hunter of the North, Surveyor, Chief of Parties in the Frozen Wastes, Lord Peter, the Dead Shepherd Reborn, Preacher of the Poor Fellows, Marshal Harrison, Absent, Shipwrecked in the Jade Sea, Grave Rob Stark, the Cadaver King, and Horror of Harrenhal, Olaf, proponent of establishing a feudal, pseudo-democratic system of great councils wherein every count votes. Sir Tim, the knight who was guided by voices. Lord Nick, Thucydides, Lord of Plagues. Sir Jack, Lord of Sir Arthur Dane, Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, Sad Prophecy Boys Club, Part 2. Lady Anna, the lovely Castellan. Pat Ironwood, the Blood Royal and Guardian of the Boneway. Luke, Lord of Lone Leaf and the Pillar of Autumn. Joe Snow, King of the Metro North and Protector of the Tri-State. Squire Matt S., future Matt S., the one who will bring balance to the kingdoms. Lord Kyle, Lord Samuel Seaworth, Sir Max, Lord Commander of the Constitutional Guard, Lady Ivory Dane, aspiring noble author in the Seven Kingdoms, Lady of Starfall, Warness of the South, and the patron of free-wheeling bisexuals. Lady Jamisa, she who suggests that coconuts migrate. Lord Christoph of Arendelle, official ice master and deliverer, the valiant, pungent, reindeer king, keeper of feisty pants, and prince consort to his ginger sweet love, Queen Anna. Lord Sir Septon Ruthers, Sir Grizzly Adams, the King's Justice, Ward of the Kingswood, and Sheriff of the Seven Kingdoms. Sir Kell, contractor in charge of continually extending the small council table. Lord Travis, Master of Ships and War of the Waves, Captain of the War Galley Nightwolf, the ship that stalks the seven seas, and wielder of the Valyrian Steel Trident Summoner, the blade that brings the deep ones. Lord Adonis II, and Lord Tyler, the prince that promises to wait patiently for the winds of winter. Thank you to all of our not a small counselors.
Thank you to all our counselors, as always.
And our spoiler warning, as we say in every episode, we'll potentially be talking about all published books. That is the 5 novels, 3 Duncan novellas, histories, interviews, the Winds Winner sample chapters, as well as Game of Thrones, a TV show. Anything and everything.
Our question this week comes from Red Relu himself, a High Lord who has renounced his allegiance to the Squishers, who asks, Who has the best first chapter in the series? For example, Jon won ASOS, Bran won A Dance with Dragons, Tyrion won A Clash with Kings, etc. That's a good question. So, among a given POV, what you have their first chapters in each book that they're in. So, which of those is the best? Who has the best first chapter to kick off a book? What do you think, Jeff?
That's a good question. It's kind of hard to beat Tyrion's first chapter in A Storm of Swords, right? When it comes to like best first chapters.
Mm-hmm.
But the one that might beat it is Samwell's first chapter in A Storm of Swords, which starts with that devastating Samwell stopping Sam took another step, and then proceeds forward from there to the various points of Sam's memory of the Battle of the Fist of the First Men, and finally his confrontation with the other, and Sam becoming Sam the Slayer, or Sam the Brave, or whatever the moniker that Sam wants to utilize at the end of the chapter. And Sam just keeps moving forward despite all of the terrible things that are going on around him. I do think it's some ones are kind of like cheats. Like I think of like John Connington's first chapter in A Dance with Dragons, which is so goddamn good, but it's also one of two chapters, right? So I mean, it's kind of
sure,
like
does that really count? Good point.
I don't know for these kind of like one-off, not one-off POVs, because John Connington will be in The Winds Winter almost certainly, but Connington is a really good. Melisandre's chapter in A Dance with Dragons, similarly, like a really really good chapter. But yeah, I for A Storm of Swords specifically, I really think that Tyrion and Samwell are the ones that really, really knock it out of the park. Now, I think we're coming up to Davos's first chapter next week, which is a very good chapter and sets up a lot of things. And weirdly enough, I think it doesn't pay off a lot of the things that Davos one sets up, especially with the religion side of things. But I'll save all those thoughts for when we get to that chapter next week. But most of these chapters start off with bangers. But yeah, I would say Tyrion and Sam in A Storm of Swords, John Connington and Melisandre, I guess, in A Dance with Dragons. Totally cheating, I know. What do you think, sir?
Well, those are all great ones. I mean, the Sam one, I think, is almost objectively the correct answer, just because I think that's, possibly the best chapter in the books, full stop. That's definitely up there. I think, as far as the later books go, Theon's first chapter in Dance is really remarkable. That first Reek chapter, there's not much that really happens in it, but that's one of those things, like I was saying about Jaime as a POV, that could have gone really wrong, bringing Theon back, bringing him back in this totally different guise, getting the audience to accept that, and then taking us through what's happening to him. Like, I know George, wrote and rewrote a ton of A Dance with Dragons, and I imagine those chapters were a lot to write tonally. But that first chapter, I'll never forget reading that first Theon chapter in Dance and seeing Reek and going, what? I thought that guy was dead. I thought that was the twist. And then reading, and then a few paragraphs in when he mentions Kyra, and I'll never forget just like feeling my spine wither as I go, oh no, it's Theon. This is what's happened. Like, that's amazing that George pulled that off, especially the wait between those books, how long it had been since we've seen Theon. That's really remarkable. And it's like, again, nothing happens in that chapter except Theon is let out of a room. But the tone of it and the way it brings you back is amazing. So I'd probably go with that one.
I think it's a really good point. Some of our fans, for those of you who are listening to our episodes, we do a weekly live stream. I did mention this last week. I'll stop mentioning it. There won't be a theme going forward, but we did get a couple interesting comments. Rohain says Sansa's first chapter in A Storm of Swords is a really good one. And I think that's actually objectively a really great choice. Not quite as good. Well, it's hard being like, which chapter is better, Samwell 1 or Sansa 1? But I do think Sansa's first chapter in Storm of Swords, where she meets the Queen of Thorns, and she has that amazing scene where she's trying to tell the Tyrells who Joffrey is, as their fool is dancing and screaming the lyrics to the Baron the Maiden Fair, is quite a good chapter. And of course, you also have that set up to a really good, interesting dialogue scene between Loras and Sansa, which sets all of that up as they're moving towards the audience chamber, not the audience chamber, towards the dinner hall they're going to be at. So yeah, that's a really good one as well. And of course, Frank brings up, as he should in every single episode, Davos's first chapter in A Clash of Kings being that being the best chapter for chapter opening for any of the point of views for A Song of Ice and Fire. So yeah, great question.
So thank you, Red Relou, for the question. If you'd like to ask us questions we must answer here on the Notacast podcast, you're welcome to become a Sworn Sword or higher level patron over at patreon.com/Notacast ASOIAF, where you can also get show notes, bonus episodes like our upcoming analysis of the movie Waltz with Bashir, free merch, access to the Nota Slack, and more.
Yes, indeed. And little treat for you folks here who are tuning in for this live stream episode. And we will announce this for our September update for all of our patrons, but we are kind of revamping our long-term stretch goal for our Patreon. Yeah, Emmett, it was a year ago, I want to say, maybe if you remember this correctly. We started this series on your favorite Winds of Winter, your favorite A Song of Ice and Fire chapter known as the Forsaken. Do you remember this back in the day? Do you remember doing this
Very
chapter?
vaguely. What the foreskin or something like that? I think
The foreskin.
I can't recall correctly.
That's so good. Yes, the foreskin by A.A. Ron. Yeah, that's not bad. Anyways, so I was thinking, how about we do this multi-part series on my favorite chapter in the Winds of Winter, at least the sample chapters that have been released so far. That is namely Theon's sample chapter, aka the Stannis point of view chapter in the Winds of Winter. Do you think that's something we can do? Yes or yes?
Heck yes. Sounds amazing to me.
I think that is something we can do indeed. So anyways, we're going to make this part of our stretch goal. So if we get our Patreon on up to 1,050 total patrons, or about 90-ish short at this point, we will do a multi-part analysis of Theon's The Winds of Winter's sample chapters. So become a Patreon or be square. But enough about Patreon. When we last checked in with Tyrion, he had drifted in and out of consciousness and finally awoke to find himself noseless and left alone in a dark room to die. He did not die, though, but that doesn't mean life is happy and full of joy, as we'll find out in this synopsis of A Storm of Swords, Tyrion 1. He woke to the creak of old iron hinges. "Oh," he croaked. At least he had his voice back, raw and hoarse though it was. The fever was still on him, and Tyrion had no notion of the hour. How long had he slept this time? He was so weak, so damnably weak. "Ooh," he called again, more loudly. Torchlight spilled through the open door, but within the chamber the only light came from the stub of a candle beside his bed. When he saw a shape moving toward him, Tyrion shivered. Here in Maegor's Holdfast, every servant was in the queen's pay, so any visitor might be another of Cersei's catspaw sent to finish the work that Sir Mandon had begun. Well, similar to Catelyn's first chapter, sure is great that things are going to be improving for Tyrion in this book from here, because this seems like a real low point, doesn't it? Let's see here. So we've got Tyrion still weak from his wounds and paranoid Cersei is still out to get him. Yes, this is obviously the worst thing for Tyrion in this book. Alas, things are not quite as bad as Tyrion believes, as it's Bronn who's come for Tyrion this time. Bronn asks if Tyrion cut himself shaving, and Tyrion just that, yeah, he did. Big-ass razor got his nose. Now let's talk a little bit about our man Bronn. The man is looking chic with nice high boots, a cloak of green silk, and a bright green chain sigil stitched into the silken cloak. Dazzling. Tyrion wants to know where Bronn has been. It's been totally 2 weeks, bro. But Bronn's like, no, it's been 4 days. And he'd had arrived twice before, only to find Tyrion asleep and dead to the world. Not dead, though my sweet sister did try. Perhaps Tyrion should not have said that aloud, but Tyrion was past caring. Cersei was behind Sir Mandon's attempts to kill him. He knew that in his gut. What's that ugly thing on your chest, Bronn? Bronn grinned. My knightly sigil. A flaming chain green on a smoky grey field. By your lord father's command. I'm Sir Bronn of the Blackwater now, imp. See you don't forget it. Annoyed, Tyrion says that he, Tyrion of House Lannister, promised Bronn a knighthood rather than his dad, who, by the way, sucks. He's also annoyed at Bronn getting rewarded for his service while Tyrion lost his nose. He asks if Tywin knighted Bronn, but no. Bronn got his knighthood from the High Septon and the 3 surviving members of the Kingsguard. Reminded of those beloved white cloaks, Tyrion mentions that Mandon died in the battle, leaving out the part where Podrick Payne shoved that dude into the river. He asks who else died. Well, not died, but Sandor Clegane fled from the battle after Tyrion ordered him to attack. Not one of my better notions. Tyrion could feel the scar tissue pull tight when he frowned. He waved Bronn towards the chair. My sister has mistaken me for a mushroom. She keeps me in the dark and feeds me shit. Pod's a good lad, but the knot in his tongue is the size of Casterly Rock, and I don't trust half of what he tells me. I sent him to bring Sir Jacelyn, and he came back and told me he's dead. Him and thousands more, Bronn said. How? Tyrion demanded, feeling that much sicker. As to how Jacelyn died, well, our good Sir Jacelyn was ordering men back to the walls after Joffrey bravely ran away from the battle. Sir Jacelyn had almost turned the tide, but then he got an arrow through the neck and was pulled from his horse and then ripped to pieces. Angry, Tyrion thinks that's a debt to lay at Cersei's feet. How about Joffrey, though? Was he in, danger? Anything? No, not really, according to Bronn. He also wasn't wounded. Okay, fine. Who commands the Gold Cloaks now that Iron Hand is dead? Why, Sir Adam Marbrand, of course. He of the dreamy looks and long, red, flowing, beautiful hair. Tyrion next turns to the mountain clansmen. What happened to his friends? What happened to them? The Stone Crows, they are still in the Kingswood, with Shagga liking the woods more than the city. Tibbet and the Burn men headed back to the Vale. Chella and the Black Ears turned up at the river gate, but the River Gate, but the Red Cloaks chased them away as the good city folk threw shit at them as they fled. Tyrion is pissed by this ingratitude of the fine city folk and how they treated his warriors. They died for them. Anyways, Tyrion next asks for an update on Alaya, which it turns out to be a really terrible thing. Cersei did free Alaya, of course, but only after she was stripped naked and then whipped bloody against a post. She was learning to read, Tyrion thought absurdly. Across his face, the scars stretched tight, and for a moment it felt as though his head would burst with rage. Alaya was a horror, true enough, but a sweeter, braver, more innocent girl he had seldom met. Tyrion had never touched her. She had been no more than a veil to hide. Shay. In his carelessness, he had never thought that what that role might cost her. I promised my sister I would treat Tommen as she treated Alaya, he remembered aloud. He felt as though he might retch. How can I scourge an 8-year-old boy? But if I don't, Cersei wins. First, but definitely not the last time in A Storm of Swords, but obligatory. But Tyrion is good. The thing is that Tyrion doesn't have Tommen anymore. The Kettleblacks relieved him of that burden from Castle Rosby. Though this is a blow to Tyrion, he feels quite happy that he doesn't have to carry out the whipping of an 8-year-old boy, especially a boy that he liked a fair amount. But wait, the Kettleblacks were Tyrion's creatures. What happened there? Well, Bronn was matching Cersei's coin, but Ozzy and Osfried Kettleblack were indicted for doing a very brave amount of fucking nothing during the Battle of the Blackwater. My hirelings betray me, my friends are scourged and shamed, and I lie here rotting, Tyrion thought. I thought I won the bloody battle. Is this what triumph tastes like? Maybe. Next, Tyrion asks for an update on Stannis. Bronn reports that Stannis' men fled the battle after Lord Renly, the terrorist, arrived on the battlefield. They turned cloak to Renly during the battle. Upset that he was upstaged by a dead Renly, Tyrion asks how Stannis escaped, why he and some of his loyalists got out via the Lyseni ships out on the bay. Great. Now do Robb Stark, Bronn. What's he been up to? Bronn, who apparently at this point is doing a nightly news segment, says the Northmen are burning their way down towards Duskendale, and that Tywin has deployed Randall Tarly to stop him. Bronn thought he might join up as Randall was a good soldier and gave out plunder to his troops. That Bronn was considering this sends Tyrion. He tells Bronn to stick around as he's captain of the Hand's Guard. Yeah, but Tyrion isn't the Hand. That doesn't matter. If Bronn is still interested in gold, then Tyrion has a task for him. What do you know of Sir Mendon Moore? Bronn laughed. I know he's bloody well drowned. I owe him a great debt. But how to pay it? He touched his face, feeling the scar. I know precious little of the man, if truth be told. He had eyes like a fish, and he wore a white cloak. What else do you need to know? Everything, Tyrion said for a start. What he wanted was proof that Sir Mandon had been Cersei's, but he dare not say so aloud. In the Red Keep, a man did best to hold his tongue. There were rats in the walls, and little birds who talked too much, and spiders. Help me up, he said, struggling with his bedclothes. It's time I paid a call on my father, and past time I let myself be seen again. Bronn makes fun of Tyrion's facial beauty, which, kind of a dick move, brah. Tyrion self-deprecates anyhow, and then asks if Marjorie Tyrell is in town. She is not, but she's en route. There are lots of Tyrells and Reachmen in King's Landing, though, and they are having very lots of much sex. They spit on me and buy drinks for the Tyrells. Tyrion then calls for Podrick as he gets out of bed. When the boy comes scrambling in, asking what Tyrion needs, Tyrion tells him he needs some clean clothes to wear. He's leaving this cell. It takes 3 men, or 2 men and 1 boy, Maester Franken, Bronn, and Podrick, to dress Tyrion given all of his wounds. The Maester changes Tyrion's dressing up. The Maester changes Tyrion's dressing on the wound to his shoulder, and then which of course sends a fury of pain through Tyrion's body. He ends up drinking a cup of green wine for pain relief and fortification, but he finds himself dizzy from drink and probably from pain too. Bronn, Tyrion, and Podrick then make their way down stone steps, passing by a servant girl who looks terrified at Tyrion's visage. Arriving at Maegor's Holdfast, they find Sir Meryn Trant on guard with the drawbridge raised. Tyrion orders it lowered, but Meryn retorts that the queen orders it raised at night when she sleeps. The queen's asleep, and I have business with my father. There was magic in the name of Lord Tyrion Lannister. Grumbling, Sir Meryn Trant gave the command and the drawbridge was lowered. A second Kingsguard knight stood sentry across the moat. Sir Osmond Kettleblack managed to smile when he saw Tyrion waddling toward him. "Feel it stronger, my lord." "Much? When's the next battle? I can scarcely wait." They make their way over to serpentine steps that go up Maegor's Holdfast. Tyrion realizes that he can't climb them given his wounds, so he swallows his pride and asks Bronn to carry him, hoping that no one sees his shame. The Outer Ward has lots of Reachmen in and around, folks hanging out, waiting for the King Joffrey's wedding to Margaery. Is Tyrion planning to attend? Ravening Weasels could not keep me away. There was this to be said for weddings over battles. At least it was less likely that someone would cut your nose. Savor that, thought Tyrion. Savor it. When they reach the Tower of the Hand, Tyrion sees his men on guard, and they admit Tyrion into the tower. On the way up the stairs, they encounter Sir Adam Barbrand, who is coming down. Surprisingly, or unsurprisingly, Adam acts chivalrously towards Tyrion. "My lord," he said, "how good to see you on your feet. I'd heard rumors of a small grave being dug." "Me too. Under the circumstances, it seemed best to get up. I hear you're commander of the city watch. Shall I offer congratulations or condolences?" "Both, I fear," Sir Adam smiled. "Death and desertion have left me with some 4,400. Only the gods and Littlefinger know how we are to go on paying wages for so many. But your sister forbids me to dismiss any." "Still anxious, Cersei? The battle's done. The gold cloaks won't help you now." "Do you come from my father?" Tyrion asked. Indeed, Adam had come from Tywin, and he left Tywin in a really shitty mood. You see, Tywin had ordered Adam to find Tyrion Lannister, but cousin Tyrion remains missing. Bronn thinks Tyrion is dead as Jacelyn Bywater looked hard for him. He tells Adam to give up the search, but Tywin is stubborn when it comes to his blood, and so is Adam as a result. Anyways, Tyrion can find the happiest man in Westeros in his solar. My solar, thought Tyrion. I believe I know the way. The way was up more steps, but this time he climbed under his own power with one hand on Pod's shoulder. Bronn opened the door for him. Lord Tyrion Lannister was seated beneath the window, writing by the glow of an oil lamp. He raised his eyes at the sound of the latch. "Tyrion." Calmly, he laid his quill aside. "I'm pleased you remember me, my lord." Tyrion released his grip on Pod, leaned his weight on his stick, then waddled closer. "Something is wrong," Tyrion knew at once. "Sir Bronn," Lord Tywin said. "Podrick, perhaps you had best wait without until we are done." Bronn gives Tywin an insolent look, but bows and leaves with Podrick practically running out of the room. As they depart, Tyrion wonders what lies Cersei has fed Tywin about Tyrion, and how about we behold this Tyrion Lannister now? How does he look since the last time we saw him? The Lord of Castle Rock was as lean as a man 20 years younger, even handsome in his own austere way. Stiff blonde whiskers covered his cheeks, framing a stern face, a bald head, a hard mouth. About his throat he wore a chain of golden hands, the fingers of each clasping the wrist of the next. "That's a handsome chain," Tyrion said, "though it looked better on me." Tywin ignores Tyrion's words and asks if Tyrion should be out of his sickbed. Yes, Tyrion should. He is sick of being in that sickbed. As to why he's there as opposed to a room with a view, it's just because the Tyrells are in town, and the Red Keep is crowded. That's all. Tywin Pinky swears it. Tyrion notes that everyone is in town for the wedding, and when will those bells sound, my lord? Joffrey and Marjorie shall marry on the first day of the new year, which, as it happens, is also the first day of the new century. The ceremony will herald the dawn of a new era. A new Lannister era, thought Tyrion. Oh, bother, I fear I've made other plans for that day. Did you come here to complain of your bedchamber and make your lame japes? I have important letters to finish. Important letters, to be sure. Some battles are won with swords and spears, others with quills and ravens. Weird. This is a reread podcast, but I don't know what Tywin is referring to here. Whatever could that mean, my lord Tywin? Some won with swords and spears, and others with letters. Who are you writing to? Are you right? Who might you be writing to? It's probably not important. Still, Tywin isn't about Tyrion's reproaches. He visited Tyrion's sickbed when it seemed like Tyrion would die. But why did Tyrion dismiss Maester Balabar? Because Balabar was trying to keep Tyrion insensate. False, Tywin declares. Balabar was a healer, and Cersei sent him to look after Tyrion when she feared for his life. Feared that I might keep it, you mean? Doubtless that's why she's never once left my bedside. Don't be impertinent. Cersei has a royal wedding to plan. I am waging a war, and you have been out of danger for at least a fortnight. Lord Tywin studied his son's disfigured face, his pale green eyes unflinching. Though the wound is ghastly enough, I'll grant you. What madness possessed you? Why, well, the foe was at the gates with a battering ram. If Jaime had led the sortie, you'd call it valor. Call this the helmets are hardly heroic defense, but Tywin knows better. Jaime would not be so dumb as to remove his helmet. P.S. You killed the guy who took your nose, right, Tyrion? Yes, that dude is quite awesomely dead, Tyrion says, but he thinks that Podrick was the one who did Mandon Moore in. He is very curious about who sent Mandon Moore, though, and he totally knows who sent him, right? No. Anyways, why is Tywin here rather than fighting Robb Stark or Stannis? He's here because they don't have the ships to assault Dragonstone, but Lord Paxter Redwine is bringing his fleet to assist with all of that. As for the Starks, Tywin sent Gregor Clegane and Randyll Tarly to deal with that northern host descending on Duskendale. Duskendale? There was nothing at Duskendale worth such a risk. Had the young wolf finally blundered? It's nothing you need trouble yourself with. Your face is pale as death, and there's blood seeping through your dressings. Say what you want and take yourself back to bed. What I want? Tyrion's throat felt raw and tight. What did he want? More than you could ever give me, father. For now, though, Tyrion deflects and asks about Littlefinger being made Lord of Harrenhal. True, but it's an empty title so long as Roose Bolton holds the castle for Robb Stark. Anyways, Littlefinger wanted the title, and he did good service by arranging the Marjorie Joffrey match. That was Tyrion's idea, point of fact. He thinks but doesn't say. Regardless, Littlefinger is up to something. Anyways, about paying off those debts. Time for Tyrion to benefit, baby. Tywin says, fine, whatever. What do you want, Tyrion? A little bloody gratitude would make a nice start. Lord Tywin stared at him, unblinking. Mummers and monkeys require applause. So did Ares, for that matter. You did as you were commanded, and I am sure it was to the best of your ability. No one denies the part you played. The part I played? What nostrils Tyrion had left must surely have flared. I saved your bloody city, it seems to me. Most people seem to feel that it was my attack on Lord Stannis' flank that turned the tide of battle. Lords Tyrell, Rowan, Redwine, and Tarly fought nobly as well. And I'm told it was your sister Cersei who set the pyromancers to making the wildfire that destroyed the Baratheon fleet. Well, that is real fucking bold of you, Tywin, to claim that it was you who won the battle. Tyrion is understandably embittered by this turn in the conversation and voices that embitterment. Tyrion then grudgingly praises Tyrion's chain as a clever stroke, and the Dornish alliance was also Tyrion's idea as well, Tywin concedes. But Tywin dislikes that Tyrion gave up a Lannister to the Dornish as a hostage. But no matter, they'll have their own Dornish hostage as soon as the Dornish come to King's Landing to take up their council's seat. Would that a council seat were all Martell came to claim, Lord Tywin said. You promised him vengeance as well? I promised him justice. Call it what you will. It still comes down to blood. Not an item in short supply, surely. I splashed through lakes of it during the battle. Tyrion saw no reason not to cut to the heart of the matter. Or have you grown so fond of Sir Gregor that you cannot bear to part with him? Well, per Tywin, Gregor is quite useful as a monster, and hey, Tyrion, you too have monsters in your employ, like Bronn and the Clansmen. Tyrion thinks that's a good point, but hey, maybe like you can get other monsters, Dad? Maybe? But seriously, Tywin's got all these letters to write, so get the fuck lost, Tyrion. Tyrion rose on unsteady legs, closed his eyes for an instant as a wave of dizziness washed over him, and took one shaky step towards the door. Later, he reflected that he should have taken a second, and then a third. Instead, he turned. What do I want, you ask? I'll tell you what I want. I want what is mine by rights. I want Casterly Rock. Tywin's mouth grew hard. Your brother's birthright? Tyrion corrects Tywin. Jaime cannot inherit as he's a Kingsguard knight, even if Tywin won't acknowledge it. Tyrion is Tywin's son and the lawful heir. Sorry, not sorry, Dad. Lord Tywin's eyes were a pale green flecked with gold, as luminous as they were merciless. Casterly Rock, he declared in a flat, cold, dead tone. And then, never. The word hung between them, huge, sharp, poisoned. I knew the answer before I asked, Tyrion thought. 18 years since Jaime joined the Kingsguard, and I never once raised the issue. I must have known. I must have always known. Why? He made himself ask, though he knew he would rue the question. You ask that? You who killed your mother to come into the world. You are an ill-made, devious, disobedient, spiteful little creature full of envy, lust, and low cunning. Men's laws give you the right to bear my name and display my colors, since I cannot prove that you are not mine. To teach me humility, the gods have condemned me to watch you waddle about, wearing that proud lion that was my father's sigil, and his father's before him. But neither gods nor men shall ever compel me to let you turn Casterly Rock into your whorehouse. Tyrion suddenly realizes why Tywin is so angry at him. Cersei had told Tywin about Alaya. Tywin doesn't give a shit about this sex worker's name. P.S. What was the name of the whore that Tyrion had married when he was a boy? Tysha. He spat out the answer defiant. And that camp follower on the Green Fork? Why do you care? He asked, unwilling to even speak Shay's name in his presence. I don't. No more than I care if they live or they die. It was you who had Yaya whipped. It was not a question. Tywin basically shrugs his shoulders. Tyrion threatened Tommen, or so Cersei said. Was that a lie? Not a lie exactly, but Tyrion was trying to keep Alaya safe. To save a whore's virtue, you threatened your own house, your own kin? Is that the way of it? You were the one who taught me that a good threat is more telling than a blow. Not that Joffrey hasn't tempted me sore a few hundred times. If you're so anxious to whip people, start with him. But Tommen, why would I harm Tommen? He's a good lad, and my own blood. As was your mother. Lord Tywin arose abruptly to tower over his dwarf son. Go back to bed, Tyrion, and speak to me no more of your rights to Casterly Rock. You shall have your reward, but it shall be one I deem appropriate to your service and station. And make no mistake, this was the last time I will suffer you to bring shame onto House Lannister. You are done with whores. The next one I find in your bed, I'll hang. Fuck. Talk about one of the most devastating dialogue scenes in this book. Wow, what a start to Tyrion's arc in A Storm of Swords. And that is the synopsis to Tyrion won A Storm of Swords. What did you think, sir?
Tyrion was the protagonist of A Clash of Kings. He had the most chapters by far. He was the hand of the king, presiding over the seat of power like Ned before him, and the book built to his last stand at the Battle of Blackwater. Unlike Ned, he made it out of the book, or most of them did anyway, but you can't exactly call it a happy ending. Tyrion's story in Storm of Swords is about what it feels like to not be the protagonist anymore. It feels like the second half of the story begun in Clash, the mirror image. We had the rise, and now we have the fall. This chapter grounds that arc in Tyrion's relationship with his father Tywin, and their showdown is one of the big dramatic pivot points of the series. The only bad thing I can say about this chapter is that it sets the bar so high that the next few Tyrion chapters will have trouble reaching it. That's just how good it is.
You're right about that. And there's been this kind of like, it's just a lot on Twitter, especially, but there's been this larger movement in the Song of Ice and Fire fandom and really culture as a whole to strip complex characters in fiction of nuance and assign them a value on strict binaries of good or bad or hero or villain. And in the Song of Ice and Fire fandom, this character who stands at the greatest crossroads of this shitty cultural trend is Tyrion Lannister. But what this chapter does is stand to thwart those binaries, asking readers to stop trying to assign Tyrion into a fucking D&D alignment chart. What Tyrion wants readers to do is to get past those binaries and look deep into the character of Tyrion Lannister. And frankly, George wants us to look deep into the character of Tywin Lannister too. That said, I'm fairly confident that George doesn't want readers to leave with Dr. Manhattan's "I understand" without condoning or condemning mantra regarding these characters. We're intended to look deep into the complex psychologies and backgrounds of Tyrion and Tywin and respond to it like all great art should make us do, respond to things. But to get to that devastatingly emotional dialogue scene where we understand who Tyrion and Tywin are at their root levels, George provides us a news dump, a series of events outside of Tyrion's purview and control, which pushes the dwarf towards one of the best conversation scenes in all of A Song of Ice and Fire.
When we covered Jaime 1 with Shiloh, she pointed out how his story in this book plays off Tyrion's in interesting ways. Jaime 1 opens with him being let out of his cell. Tyrion 1 opens with the creak of his door opening. The Lannister brothers build to a confrontation at the end of the book, when Jaime comes to let Tyrion out of yet another cell and reveal the terrible truth about Tysha and their father. Here at the beginning, we get a mirror image of that scene. Instead of Jaime, it's Bronn. And while Jaime will have his own mutilation to share when he frees Tyrion, handless and noseless the Lannister boys, Bronn immediately makes fun of Tyrion's wound. And this sets the pattern for how Tyrion will fit into the new Game of Thrones in King's Landing. Everything he did as Hand will be swept under the rug. The game changed while I lay rotting in my bed, and no one will tell me the rules. With Tywin back in town, no one has any incentive to support Tyrion. Varys told him that power resides where people believe it resides. In the last book, people believed Tyrion was in charge. So he was. Now no one believes he's in charge. So he isn't.
Exactly. And with Tyrion's constant meditations about his mind being his weapon and Varys' shadow on a wall, ding, monologue echoing on the backdrop of Tyrion's chapters. Remember, one part of that whole monologue was Varys musing about whether knowledge is power. We're at a place where Tyrion is in the dark. That darkness is actual and metaphorical in these chambers, here with Tyrion alone in the dark and also not knowing what's transpiring around him in the greater whole of Westeros. This is one of those spots where I look at Tyrion and see how Tyrion's love of learning is not one of those love of knowledge for knowledge's sake type of deals. Like, Tyrion's not really interested in like, yes, I know the great number of many things for the betterment of the world. Because in a Lannister world, knowledge is power. And Tyrion especially used his mind in A Clash of Kings to aid his rise to power as Hand of the King. But Tyrion, as he'll later say, has been kept in the dark and fed shit. He's lost his power, information that he can turn into power. Information that he can turn into power, in other words. And to judge by how Tywin treats him later, this was intentional on his father's part. Tywin is also a believer of this idea that knowledge is power, and what he knows, as opposed to what people don't know, grants him power over others. And Tywin will not tolerate any rival to his power. So I imagine that the idea was that Tywin was consolidating power within the city, and to do that, he isolated Tyrion politically by keeping him in the dark and out of the news. Tyrion's arc in A Storm of Swords is quite the contrast to the Tyrion in love with the Game of Thrones for its own sake back in A Clash of Kings. That Tyrion was gravely wounded only aided in Tywin's efforts to strip his son of all vestiges of his former power.
So instead of demonstrating his courage that he went out there, he fought, he got this wound, instead Tyrion's wound becomes a source of mockery. It's woven into the narrative around his disability. You're a freak, and that wound just further proves it. Bronn, by contrast, looks better than ever. His hair is freshly washed and brushed. His belt, boots, and cloak are of much higher quality than before. That's bad news for Tyrion. It means someone else is taking care of Bronn, taking care of him better than Tyrion ever did. Bronn now fits the image Tyrion was never able to live up to. This is how the winners of the battle want the world to see them. The biggest sign of that is the sigil across Bronn's chest, the flaming chain of the Blackwater, decked out in wildfire green. It's Sir Bronn now, and don't you forget it. That chain is a perfect symbol for Tyrion's story in this book. He doesn't get credit for saving the Lannister cause with that chain. Instead, that image now belongs to Tywin, who gave Bronn the knighthood that Tyrion promised him. So Tywin has taken his victory away, and he's also taken another chain, the Hands chain, that Tyrion will use to strangle Shay, the other lowborn person in his service. Storm is all about literal and figurative chains. Bronn's words send the same message as his appearance. You have been replaced. The power structure you built has collapsed. Now we learn that Jacelyn Bywater was killed in the battle. Not by Stannis' men, though, by his own men, the Gold Cloaks, as they broke and followed Joffrey. This resonates across Storm of Swords. From the Night's Watch mutiny to the Red Wedding, everybody's betraying everybody else in this book. But it has particular significance for Tyrion. He too feels betrayed. He wasn't torn down by Stannis after all, but by his own family. His reaction to Bywater's death is telling. He thinks, another debt to lay at Cersei's door. It's linked in his mind to his wound, all part of the same grievance. The Lannisters treat everything as just ammunition against each other. After all, he warned her what would happen if she pulled Joffrey back. Now Bywater has been replaced by Tywin's crony, Adam Marbrand. Tyrion realizes he's lost the Gold Cloaks. What about the clans? He's lost them too. Tywin refused to pay them, and the people of the city drove them off. So much for the Lannisters paying their debts. As Tyrion thinks, the clansmen died to hold the city, as he almost did. He's rejected by both his father and his people, just like the clansmen were. As he thinks, whilst Tyrion lay drugged and dreaming, his own blood had pulled his claws out, one by one. Tyrion is lost in paranoia and alienation, stronger chains than the ones Jaime wears. It's a result of his isolation. He doesn't even know what time it is as the chapter starts. All he can ask is who goes there, like the opening line of Hamlet. Even seeing Bronn's shadow makes him shiver. He thinks it's one of Cersei's servants come to kill him, like Stannis' shadow killed Renly. Tyrion was almost assassinated, and he thinks his own sister was responsible. The personal is always political for Tyrion. Bronn brings that home brutally. Tyrion wants Alaya freed now that Joffrey is safe. Bronn says she was set free, shoved out the gate, naked and bleeding, after being whipped. We sit up in shock, just as Tyrion does, because this is a sudden shift in tone. Politically speaking, it makes sense that Tyrion lost the watch and even Bronn. But this? The torture and humiliation of a bystander? There's no way to sugarcoat this as just part of the transition. No way to make it look pretty like Bronn's fresh haircut and new boots. This is cruelty. Deliberately over-the-top cruelty, because that's the political signature of Tywin Lannister, and it's how he handles his family life as well. Remember, this is how he took control of House Lannister. After his father Tytos died, Tywin paraded his father's mistress naked through town. He rules his children's bodies just as ruthlessly, along with those of any women unfortunate enough to cross Tyrion's path. He uses them as public examples of his power to get people to believe that power resides with him. And he believes that's more important than the well-being of his victims. Tysha found that out. Now Alaya has as well. Tyrion thinks it was Cersei at first, and he has reason to think that. But hey, she learned about the spectacle of fearsome acts from Dad. And so did Tyrion. For a moment, all he can process is the horror of it. A sweet girl who was learning to read, who suffered because of him. Because he wanted Shay so badly, he refused to think of the cost. Then he remembers the other side of the coin. His promise to pay back any harm to Alaya with the same harm done to Tommen. You remember Tommen, the sweet little kid who loves kittens and hates beets? Get ready to whip him. Tyrion is sick at the thought of scourging his innocent nephew, but he prepares himself to do it, because if not, then Cersei wins. That really reveals how much Tyrion has bought into the competitive kill or be killed worldview that animates his father. Even as he's sickened by the results, Tyrion just doesn't know any other way to operate. He's secretly relieved when it turns out he's lost control of Tommen as well. I mean, this is a loss of power like the rest, but it means he doesn't bear direct responsibility. He gets to keep his hands clean. Those bloody realities of power are papered over by the glorious image. As Tyrion thinks, after all his careful planning, he was outdone by Renly's armor, by a dead man, and now people are just going around praising the Tyrells. He sums it up in his thoughts. My hirelings betray me, my friends are scourged and shamed, and I lie here rotting. I thought I won the bloody battle. Is this what triumph tastes like?
It does for the Lannisters, man. And I think that's such an amazing dynamic that George has here in Tyrion's first chapter in Storm, because let's face it, this book is framed within the triumph of House Lannister. As we covered last week with Catelyn, the Lannister star is waxing as the Stark and Baratheon stars are waning given events on the Blackwater and the Southern Alliance that's been forged. So at the macro strategic political level, we are approaching the apex of Lannister power. That is that we're not even at the point where the Lannister star is shiniest here. And still, when you get past that ivory tower off the hand and down to the individual person level, the Tyrions and Lyses of the world are miserable. Thanks, Dad. I think a miserable Tyrion Lannister, I mean, this might be cruel, but in terms of like literature, I think I saw recently that you need to be cruel to your characters. But I think a miserable Tyrion Lannister is the exact correct focus here, because God, it would be so insufferable to have Cersei being the point of view of this chapter and the start of the triumph gloating here. But the greater dynamic of, is this really a victory for Tyrion, is something that's really good. Because from Tyrion's perspective, it looks like he lost just about everything. His power base, his friends, the credit for victory, and of course his nose. Now, A Song of Ice and Fire is not some sort of morality play where good deeds are rewarded and evil deeds are punished. And Tyrion is cynical enough to know this. However, what he might not be seeing is that these are the consequences of supporting the bad side, of keeping a monster in the form of Joffrey in power, delaying Stannis just long enough for Tywin to arrive to claim his victory and supplant Tyrion. This is what working for selfish assholes feels like. I mean, come on, you folks have all worked in retail or some sort of world where you've had some boss, some toxic asshole who takes credit for the good deeds that you do. Your friends get fired and your other friends get promoted away from you to isolate you. This is why working for Joffrey and his true benefactor Tywin was never going to work out in the long term for Tyrion. Victory was always going to be bitter, because that's what working for the villains of the story does. That's what working for assholes does to you. Ultimately, though, like I was saying earlier, this information dump and Tyrion's emptiness works kind of as a catalyst for him to move on. Not like emotionally, of course, but physically, he's moving on.
Exactly. All of this convinces Tyrion that it's past time for him to get the hell out of this room and rejoin the Game of Thrones. It's his rebirth, like Jaime. He even has Podrick at his side, who is later squire to Jaime's companion, Brienne. But the parallels kind of break down there. Jaime had that nice pale pink dawn and bird song to greet him. Nothing like that for Tyrion. He's being reborn into a nest of vipers. Jaime was weaker for his time in the Tully dungeons, but Tyrion is still so woozy he can't dress himself. Pus and blood are leaking from his wounds. Jaime was drunk, but he was kind of having fun with it. He was kind of enjoying being drunk for the first time in a while. Tyrion is drunk on dream wine to numb the pain. I think that sums up the different positions they're in right now. The first human Tyrion meets outside his room is a serving girl who stares at him with wide eyes. As with Bronn's insults, this sets the pattern. Tyrion is very sensitive to lower-class women in particular reacting negatively to his appearance. We learned that back in Book 1, when he thought to himself, there was a look the girls got in their eyes sometimes when they first beheld the lordling they'd been hired to pleasure, a look that Tyrion Lannister did not ever care to see again. And now he's seeing it again. Now the looks will be even worse than ever. The dwarf has risen from the dead, he thinks, but there's no joy in it, because he's uglier than ever, according to him, and the world will deny him dignity on that basis. The next challenge is the Kingsguard. This is also how Tyrion's story began in Clash of Kings, with Mandon Moore guarding the council chamber. Then, as now, there was magic in the name of Lord Tywin Lannister. But is there magic in Tyrion's name? Only if Tywin approves of him. Tyrion's authority derives from Dad, and so does his identity. Meryn Trant grumbles and steps aside. Osmond Kettleblack knows how to play his role a little better. He smiles and inquires after Tyrion's health, but Tyrion can tell it's a performance, so it's no comfort. And I think we've all been there if we've just come off something embarrassing or humiliating, a setback of some kind, and everyone is being pretend nice. That can just make us even angrier because you can just tell that it's not genuine. Same with Tywin's guards. Tyrion knows these men, and they know him, but they won't look at his face for long. Tyrion is more alone than ever before. Adam Marbrand treats Tyrion more warmly than the rest. He's like Garland Tyrell. He's the kindest member of the group of snakes that's looking to bite you. He's the nicest one. Sir Adam at least knows what it's like to have the other lions growling at you. Cersei won't let him dismiss any gold cloaks. Even in victory, she's as paranoid as Tyrion. They never learned how to be happy from Dad because he's never been happy, not since Joanna died. Tywin, meanwhile, is pissed off that the gold cloaks still can't track down his nephew Tyrek, vanished during the riot in Book 2. This, of course, is here to remind the reader about it, so it's not out of nowhere when we meet Tyrek again, but it also ties directly into the themes of this chapter. Bronn says they should give up the search, but Adam Marbrand says that Tywin is stubborn where his blood is concerned. He will have Tyrek back, alive or dead. And that sums up Tywin's relationship to his family. He keeps them close, but more as possessions than people. He doesn't want Tyrek back because he loves and misses his nephew. He wants Tyrek back because Tyrek is his, damn it, and losing Tyrek makes him look weak. So, dead or alive, getting back Tyrek's corpse serves the same purpose as getting him back alive. Making Tywin look strong again. That's all he cares about.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. And, there's this character here, this character who's somewhat compelling. This guy is Sir Adam Marbrand. Call this Micah's minor moment corner of the chapter when it comes to these types of things. As our patron Micah is a huge fan of the minor characters in A Song of Ice and Fire, and follow him on Twitter. I think it's Micah_Clark, Micah_of Clark, I believe, on Twitter. He keeps a good tally of these types of characters. Adam Marbrand is framed in similar lenses Garland Tyrell, which you pointed out, which is an excellent catch, sir. And we're sympathetic to Adam Marbrand as a result. He jests with Tyrion, doesn't take himself too seriously, and hey, he's not a monster like Amory Lordshire or Gregor Clegane, right? He's a totally good dude, right? Well, no, he's not. Or at least he's a dude who's helping to legitimize an illegitimate regime. If Tywin Lannister's retinue was all Gregor Clegane's and Amory Lorch's, it'd be way, way easy to paint the Lannisters as unmitigated villains. But Adam Marbrand is a knight, a good knight, chivalrous even, and yet he's in service of Tywin Lannister. And there's no hint that Adam is troubled by his service to the barbarous war crime of a campaign that Tywin Lannister inflicted on the Riverlands. In fact, if you flash back to a Game of Thrones and that council that was taking place in Tyrion's final chapter, Sir Adam was one of the voices urging Tywin to stay at war with Robb Stark. The point for characters like Adam Marbrand is that they help. The point for Adam Marbrand in literature, one more time, the point for characters like Adam Marbrand in A Song of Ice and Fire and in literature in total and in general is that these good-seeming guys help legitimize the villainy of characters like Tywin. Readers like him because he seems like a good dude. Would a good dude be serving a monster of a liege lord? In point of fact, very much yes. And here we see Adam carrying out Tywin's order of having the entire force of gold cloaks out looking for Tyrek's body or person, rather than securing the city or helping repair the damage from the battle. This might be uninteresting to a lot of folks, but I think this gives readers a pretty interesting insight into Tywin Lannister and how he governs and plays the Game of Thrones. Tywin really genuinely does not give a shit about the basics of how to exercise power on behalf of the people he's supposed to be safeguarding as a ruler. And look, for the record, I do think maybe a missing teenager is worth a search or two, but the entire core of gold cloaks on the case seems a little excessive, doesn't it? But as you were saying, this is Tywin treating his family as possessions, pieces to be moved on the Game of Thrones. At the same time, I also think that this search is a statement by Tywin. He can put the entire police force into a search for a single family member. In the communications world, Tywin is communicating that he's the new sheriff in town, and with the snap of a finger, he can make the entire police force bend to his will. As he'll say later about the 77 courses and 1,000 guests for Joffrey and Marjorie's wedding, extravagance has its uses. We must demonstrate the power and wealth of Casterly Rock for all the realm to see. The Tywin can put all the cops in King's Landing on the case to search for one Lannister is a total extravagance. Yet it's an extravagance that demonstrates Tywin's power. All power vortexes its way down from the top and then gets sucked right back up again.
Tywin does have these like internally consistent arguments for his behavior that, don't stand up to scrutiny, but you can see why they kind of make sense to him. And yet George keeps poking holes in them. Tywin's stubbornness about family doesn't prevent him from despising Tyrion and treating him like an outcast. And yet, despite being treated so poorly by his father, Tyrion has learned from Tywin. Tyrion also despises weakness. He says so in this chapter. He's trying to overcome his own weaknesses, and his father is about to rip open all of those wounds at once. It's been a good chapter so far, but now it becomes great. This scene expands on the first Tyrion-Tywin scene, back at the crossroads in Book 1. As I said then, their relationship is one of the most dramatically potent elements in the series. It's complex, but it comes through so clearly. You know how it's going to go as soon as he walks in and the Succession music starts playing, or the Godfather music, or whatever dramatic music you want to put over the scene. It worked perfectly. Tyrion's story in this book begins with his father and ends with him too, as Tyrion delivers George's thesis statement for their relationship. I'm you, writ small. Now, that's not to say their actions and worldviews are identical, but there's an uncanny sense that they are two halves of one whole, that this is really an argument happening inside one person's head. George builds that dynamic into every detail. When Adam Marbrand says that Tywin is in his solar, Tyrion thinks my solar. He's resentful about his position being usurped, but that phrasing reinforces the sense that at some level, Tywin and Tyrion are the same person. Tyrion says the hand chain looks handsome on his father, just looked better on me. And appearances are at the core of the grievances between father and son. Tywin is all about keeping up appearances. Tyrion can't do that. George reintroduces Tywin to us. It's been a while. He emphasizes Tywin's austere good looks, the flatness of his belly, the impression of sternness and strength. That's how he wants the world to see House Lannister. As Joanna tells Jaime in his dreams, he wanted to make it so no one would laugh at them. But everyone laughs at Tyrion. That's why he was shuttered away in a tiny room in Maegor's Holdfast while Tywin and the Tyrells took over the city. He's inconvenient for the narrative his father is creating, the century of House Lannister, which will begin with Joffrey's wedding to Marjorie. For Tywin, this is his life's work. He can almost taste it. And here comes Tyrion with his sarcasm and his ghastly wound. What's he doing here? In Drama 101 terms, what does Tyrion want out of this scene? A little bloody recognition would be a nice start. He wants his efforts acknowledged. He wants to be a true member of the family, reflecting his sacrifice in the battle. He wants his father's love. He has refused all of that.
He really is. It's something that's really a compelling part of this dynamic, is what Tyrion wants is denied him, and that makes this scene so compelling. One of the many things that makes this scene so compelling. And another thing that really stands out is something that might be a little bit understudied, and that's how small Tyrion's personality seems when he's standing in front of Tywin, in front of his dad. Because if you remember throughout A Clash of Kings, Tyrion was always the guy with the smart play, the quick wit, and he wasn't intimidated by those around him. Remember that scene where he's standing in front of Joffrey when Joffrey's having Sansa beaten by the Kingsguard? Like, Tyrion was not intimidated by King Joffrey there. That's not the case here in A Storm of Swords, because I think it's such a great touch for how George writes Tyrion, because Tyrion is clearly intimidated and his quips don't land at all. Instead of Tyrion being a constant intellectual threat in this chapter, Tyrion is reacting and shifting to different stimuli around him. Because in Clash, Tyrion was able to get away with snarking his way through the book because he was the biggest political dog in King's Landing. But it wasn't through Tyrion's own skill set that he came into this position of power. Now, Tyrion is obviously skilled politically, but the point of fact is that this was all framed within the imprimatur of his father, Tywin. Tyrion had come to King's Landing with the express authorization of Tywin. Hell, Tywin seemed to have envisioned Tyrion as basically an extension of himself and his power in King's Landing. That filtered down into how Tyrion was able to carry himself in the city itself. The problem for Tyrion is that he started to believe that his own power base was because of his own action, personality, and policies. In retrospect, Tyrion's final thoughts from his 7th chapter from A Clash of Kings was Tyrion really buying into his own bullshit. It is real, all of it, he thought. The wars, the intrigues, the great bloody game, and me at the center of it. Me. The dwarf, the monster, the one they scorned and laughed at. But now I hold it all. The power, the city, the girl. That was what I was made for. And gods forgive me, but I do love it. While never truly forgetting his father, as we see throughout his internal monologues in A Clash of Kings, Tyrion started to believe that the game he was playing was one of his own making, that he had become powerful in his own right. This chapter displays this as a lie that Tyrion told himself, that no one had stood up for Tyrion after his wounding, that few had visited him, that he has two people, Podrick and Bronn, left to him, shows that the power Tyrion had was mostly borrowed from Tywin in A Clash of Kings. And with that unconscious realization, Tyrion's jokes don't land. His witticisms seem forced. His personality shrinks before his own father.
Oh, that's great stuff, man. I think that's exactly right. Tyrion's realizing, oh, right, this is where I got this shtick from.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of a pale copy when you sent me next to the original. And even more than Bronn, Tywin is belittling Tyrion's courage, focusing only on his appearance. That wound is ghastly. What were you thinking? As Tyrion points out, Tywin would have nothing but praise for berserker heroism if it was Jaime. Tywin's rejoinder that Jaime would never remove his helm rings false when we remember the Whispering Wood. Tywin reframes Tyrion's desire for recognition as shallow and foolish. Mummers and monkeys require applause. For that matter, so did Aerys. These are cruel comparisons, designed to call attention to Tyrion's disability. You are more monkey than man. You ought to be a sideshow performer. Throughout the conversation, Tyrion is being made hyper-aware of his own body. He's aware that he's climbing up on the seat. He thinks about how his nostrils would flare if he still had any. Tywin is trying to intimidate Tyrion, hence his unblinking stare. He wants Tyrion to feel bad about himself, stop standing up for himself, to internalize these insults. That will allow Tywin to rewrite recent history. He reduces Tyrion's efforts to the part you played, while claiming that he really turned the tide and that Cersei deserves more credit for getting the wildfire started. Tywin gives Littlefinger more credit than his own son. He gives Littlefinger the credit for the Tyrell marriage, and even manages to find fault with Tyrion making an alliance with Dorne. This is infuriating for the reader as well as Tyrion. We know that Cersei had no real plan for the wildfire, and that the chain was considerably more than a clever stroke. Tywin does that mealy-mouthed politician thing where he says, most people seem to feel that he won the battle. Which people? Most. Many are saying. Some people have said, oh, really, Tywin? You had nothing to do with that. You're going to pretend that public opinion is a law of nature, and you just walked backward into your reputation. Interesting. Interesting.
Tywin Lannister is Donald Trump. I mean, you remember that all the time. The way that he would phrase is like, many people are saying this.
Other people
thing.
Are saying. What people? Others.
Many
not
other
me,
people.
Even though I'm saying it right now to you. Right. But it's not me. Others.
Oh my God! Yeah, I'm just now I'm imagining. Yeah, yeah. Anyways, I'm gonna stop with the Tywin Donald Trump parallels because too much. And I think it's really true what you're saying, because Tywin is embodying Varys' shadow on a wall, because power lies where men say it lies. With Tyrion out of action, out of the limelight, Tywin was there to suck up all the oxygen of Westeros and write the narrative of the battle. I mean, think back to Sansa's final chapter in A Clash of Kings. Tyrion only comes up once. And that's in Sansa's head. He's not acknowledged by all of the many things that are being proclaimed from the throne room. Everyone else is rewarded by Tywin or his cronies, but Tyrion's deeds go unmentioned. At a level, this is the consequence of something you brought up so well in our Tyrion Clash chapters, that Tyrion is shit for PR. He might be an excellent politician, but he does not get ahead of his own PR. He only manages to capture the zeitgeist once, and that's at the Blackwater, where his men shout, half man, half man. But there was no concentrated PR effort for Tyrion to rally the small folk or even the nobility to his cause. Instead, Tyrion did a lot of work to keep Joffrey in power, work that was easily co-opted by Tywin because Tyrion hadn't put the work in to capture the love of the people. I mean, I was thinking here, Tywin does acknowledge his chain, but why didn't Tyrion end up naming the chain after himself, or name one of the trebuchets after something that he was doing, or do something that would have amplified his work in King's Landing? It doesn't. It's now we're seeing the consequences of Tyrion's lack of his own PR. We're coming into focus here at the start of A Storm of Swords.
He's learned the model of ruling through fear from Tywin, and that's led him starved for love, as you can see so clearly in this scene. The only unguarded praise Tywin offers is that Tyrion's chain was a clever stroke, and then he immediately bitchily follows it up with, is that what you wanted to hear? Well, yes and no. Those are technically words of praise, but the warmth behind them is what's missing. Despite Tywin keeping his distance, George keeps reminding us of all these two have in common, especially their penchant for hiring cutthroats to do their dirty work. Tyrion may have sold out his father's pet monster Gregor to the Dornish, but as he realized in Clash of Kings, he has his own baby killer on the payroll, namely Bronn. No matter how much Tyrion and Tywin resent each other, they are each other. There's no getting away from each other, and that finally overflows in full. Tyrion walks toward the door and then turns back. George pauses to note that he'll regret it, letting the audience know that something truly awful must be coming. Earlier, Tyrion couldn't quite put into words what he wanted from his father. It was both primal and inchoate, and too painful to broach, too intimate, too earnest. Tyrion likes his irony. But now, finally, he is sincere. He wants Casterly Rock, because it's his by rights. His by rights, that sounds familiar. Which character have we heard that from a whole lot before? Stannis, of course. And just as Stannis wants the throne as a proxy for the love he never got from his brothers, Tyrion wants the Rock as a proxy for his father's affection. Like, who knows what Tyrion would actually do as Lord of Casterly Rock? He never really thinks about it. That's not what this is about. It's about getting Tywin to stand up before the realm and declare that Tyrion is his son and he's proud, etc. Tywin initially faints, as he's been doing all scene, pretending that Jaime is his heir. Tyrion points out the obvious. Jaime gave up the Rock along with pretty much everything else when he took the White Cloak. Naming Tyrion the heir would just be following protocol at that point.
Right. And in fact, George did address the issue objectively of Jaime inheriting Casterly Rock in a So Spake Martin right after A Storm of Swords was published in the United States. Elio Garcia asked, if the Kingsguard forswear wives or inheritances, how can Jaime Lannister be heir to Casterly Rock? George R. Martin responds, simple answer, Lord Tywin is in denial. If he admitted that Jaime wasn't heir, he'd have to admit that Tyrion was, and that he has such a hard time, and that he has a hard time swallowing. Denial is such an interesting choice of words to describe Tywin, as many folks like to think of Tywin as this cold, calculating Machiavellian type. He's just doing things because they're the right things to do, even though they're hard and cold, and he can't put emotions into it. The truth, as we see in this chapter, and as George talked about before with the use of the word denial, is that Tywin's belief system is deeply rooted in his emotions. It's not quite as objective as his bullshit would make it out to be.
Yeah, that's a great point. And that denial, I think, holds true also for Jaime and Cersei and what they've been getting up to together. Because I think at some deep, deep level of cognition, Tywin knows about that too. But he's just managed to keep a wall up, and Tyrion is making that impossible for him. And so Tywin stops dodging and looks his son right in the eye, like looking at his reflection in the mirror. George describes Tywin's eyes, a pale green flecked with gold, as luminous as they were merciless. This grounds us in the moment. It's like we're sitting there as everything goes still. Tyrion's future depends on the thoughts behind those eyes. And then Tywin speaks. Casterly Rock, he declared in a flat, cold, dead tone. And then, never. That word is like a weapon, as George describes it. Huge, sharp, and poisoned, killing the person Tyrion could be. As Tyrion thinks, he never brought it up all these years, despite how obvious it was, as you say, that Jaime had given up the Rock. He must have known that he would be disinherited in the end, that he would never be welcome, that his own family has rejected him. Even if you weren't raised by an abusive parent, I think most of us are familiar with this cold kind of relationship that suddenly goes hot. So much has been kept just beneath the surface. So many insults have been bitten back that there's a hideous catharsis to it all bursting through. Why do you hate me, Father? Why have you finally given me a chance only to take it away? Why do you take everything away? Because you took her away. You killed your mother to come into this world. It's a statement so hateful and unjust, it still makes me wince just viscerally, as if Tyrion had any control over that, as if he didn't lose out on a mother when Joanna died. Grief twists even the strongest mind, but Tywin owed Tyrion reassurance after that. He owed him even more love than normally, and he didn't do it. And that is the original sin of their relationship. Everything bad, everything poisonous comes from that.
You're absolutely correct that Tywin is being incredibly hateful and unjust, and yet I can't help but feel this works so well within the context of the character of Tywin Lannister, because Tywin's coldness to Tyrion, really to anyone, was always present in the character of Tywin himself. But there was a passage that a lot of people have pointed out from The World of Ice and Fire, and how Grand Maester Pycelle described Tywin and Joanna's relationship. Only Lady Joanna knows the man beneath the armor, Grand Maester Pycelle wrote the Citadel, and all his smiles belong to her and her alone. I do avow that I have even observed her make him laugh, not once, but upon 3 separate occasions. I mean, granting that Pycelle is the ultimate fucking suck-up among the Lannister retinue and in the small council, I do think Tywin loved Joanna in his own way and let down his wall-sized guard around her. And in Tywin's mind, Tyrion took Joanna away, stripping Tywin of his emotional core and his connection to happiness. It's not Tyrion's fault, not at all. He was just a baby, and Tywin blaming Tyrion for Joanna's death is supremely evil and unjust. Yet it makes character sense for Tywin to be this way to Tyrion. It's in keeping with who Tywin is. And Tyrion's lifestyle, his choices, only prove how right Tywin is to hate his son. In Tywin's mind, anyhow.
Right, that's the thing. Like, Tywin isn't wrong when he calls Tyrion devious, disobedient, and spiteful. Yeah, Tyrion absolutely is all of those things. He absolutely is full of envy, lust, and low cunning. We've seen Tyrion's POV. We have seen all those things at work. But Tywin has never made any effort to help Tyrion improve himself, because Tywin prefers to think that Tyrion isn't his son at all. That's why he brought up the Mad King earlier, because he wants to believe that he could never make a son like Tyrion, only Aerys, only the king who belittled him. Moreover, Tywin blames Tyrion for things for which he's just not responsible. Not only Joanna's death, but Tywin blames Tyrion for his own disability. You're a little creature, and it pains me to watch you waddle about wearing my proud lion. For Tywin, Tyrion represents the fear that nothing he does will be good enough, that he will never erase his father's shame, nor the Mad King's mockery. He claims the gods sent Tyrion to teach him humility. But if so, they failed. He claims that lion was proud when it was his father's sigil, but Tywin famously resented his father for behaving a lot like Tyrion. That's what's really going on here. Tytos shamed Tywin by carrying on publicly with his mistress, and so Tywin is determined that Tyrion will not turn Casterly Rock into your whorehouse. As Tyrion says, this is like dawn breaking. He understands now why Tywin's acting this way. Tywin had Alaya whipped, just as he had Tysha gang raped, to teach Tyrion a lesson. Your body belongs to me. I can't hurt you for all the shame you've caused me, so I'll hurt them instead. Because for Tywin, sex workers are even more inhuman than Tyrion. I don't care about their names. I don't care if they live or die. And the next one I find in your bed, I'll hang. And yet, Shay shows up in Tywin's bed instead. And it was probably Tywin who had that tunnel into Shataya's built. Tywin pays for sex, like his father before him and his son after him. The only difference is he does it secretly. So even as Tywin hates his father and son for bringing shame to the image of House Lannister, he probably also resents them for not feeling shame, for being able to do what they want in public. This is the ultimate connection between father and son. When Tywin looks at Tyrion, he sees who he would be if he didn't feel the need to repress his own desires. He can't stand that, so he takes it out on Tyrion. Tywin is just so full of shit. As we'll see when he dies, he's as full of shit as it's possible for a person to be. Tyrion was happy in the last book, or as close as he's been to happy since Tysha. Now Dad is home, and the party is over. Tyrion has been stripped of his position and his protectors. Not only that, but he's lost the dignity he briefly felt, the sense that for once in his life, he was where he belonged, doing what he was born to do. Over the course of this book, his bitterness will rise until he snaps, the steady escalation of proxy violence spilling over into patricide. And I can't blame him. Tywin has finally made plain that he does not consider Tyrion to be a person, let alone his son, who deserves his love and respect. He will not allow Tyrion to live his life. He had it coming. Yet killing Tywin will still break Tyrion, because at some level, he's killing himself. It's not Tywin who hangs Shay, who strangles her to death. No, it's Tyrion who does that. As he says, I'm you, writ small.
That is brilliantly said, sir. You really nailed the dynamic of how Tyrion killing Tywin culminates the character arc of both men. Yet Tyrion lives on in a way, and his act sends him spiraling into the abyss all the same when we catch up with him at A Dance with Dragons. The first act of Tyrion's Song of Ice and Fire arc is one shrouded in tragedy, unhappiness, and it all extends from the puppet strings of Tywin before him. And Tywin's own unhappiness extends from the puppet strings from his father. Tytos made Tywin miserable, and Tywin in turn made Tyrion miserable. Though Tywin never killed his father the way that Tyrion will do at the end of A Storm of Swords, he did so metaphorically by shaming Tytos' mistress, marching her naked through the streets of Lannisport, killing the shame his father had brought Tywin. But that shame that Tywin thought he had banished came back with Tyrion, a son who became the way he did due to the evil that his father inflicted on Tyrion and on Tysha. Tyrion's relationship with sex workers is a natural consequence of how Tywin had Tysha brutally gang raped and how Tyrion came to believe that he was unlovable due to his dwarfism. So in turn, Tywin helped foster a version of his own father into Tyrion, which led to his father hating him more as Tyrion reminded Tywin of Tytos. But the original sin of Tyrion Lannister went far deeper, as we've been talking about. Tyrion killed his mother, and Tywin's smiles had died with Joanna as a result. The hatred left behind was focused on Tyrion, and the end result was that Tyrion ends up truly killing his father, not metaphorical. And remember towards the start of the chapter when Tyrion thought he had to inflict the same shit on Tommen as was inflicted on Alaya? At chapter's end, Tyrion claims that he likes Tommen, that he would never truly harm the boy. And yet, that's exactly what Tyrion was going to do until Bronn told him he didn't have Tommen anymore. Shit rolls downhill for House Lannister generation upon generation. It's a sad, pathos-laden tragedy, and I think A Storm of Swords really brings that entire dynamic home. That opening line from Anna Karenina that we've quoted before, that great Tolstoy line, is worth citing here at the end of this analysis of Tyrion 1. All happy families resemble one another, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way.
Heck yeah, we saw that with Catelyn 1 last week. The Tullys also are unhappy in their own way. Speaking of them, moving into foreshadowing and groundwork, Tyrion is right that Harrenhal is going to mean more than an empty title to Littlefinger. And he will think back on this conversation when Littlefinger uses that title to propose a match to Lysa. So that's one of Littlefinger's more brilliant moves, I think, is realizing he doesn't really need to set foot in Harrenhal. All he needs is that title, and suddenly everyone will accept him as the potential consort of the Vale.
Yeah, so I did reread that chapter today, and I was thinking back to this chapter, and it's very clear that Tyrion's like, Dad, this guy's really bad. He's not planning on doing a good thing with this house and with this castle. He's going to be using it against us, and this guy is easily able to betray his friends, as we saw with Eddard Stark. He is going to betray us yet again. And though we have not seen the full consequence of that in A Song of Ice and Fire, I do think that is what Littlefinger is ultimately aiming at for the Winds of Winter, is really turning against House Lannister now that he has his castle, had Lysa, and also has the Vale of Arryn as well. So he's got the Vale and he's got Harrenhal. The potential remains that they could have both the Riverlands and the Vale come the Winds of Winter side with him in whatever plans he ends up executing in the Winds of Winter.
So Tyrion promises himself in this chapter he needs to look into the matter of Renly's ghost. But it's actually Jaime who finally gets the truth out of Loras that it was in fact Garland. And this isn't a big reveal. It just ends up being kind of funny in the moment when Loras has to admit that, yeah, I wasn't as big and tough as Renly. So I couldn't wear his armor. Kind of a humiliating moment. But yeah, even Tyrion, it's interesting how many threads are set up here that Tyrion kind of has to follow up on, but kind of really doesn't, because he gets consumed with the Mandon Moore one specifically, even though, that's kind of past its sell-by date for him.
It's funny like that, how that revelation is kind of like comes out, because it's like kind of set up as this big thing at the end of A Clash of Kings and the start of A Storm of Swords, but it's almost like kind of an anti-climax in terms of that reveal, because you're like, wait, Renly is alive? You're like, no, we absolutely saw him dead. Was he resurrected? We've seen some resurrected characters that we see in A Storm of Swords, but no, he wasn't resurrected. It was just Garland Tyrell wearing the armor of Renly for the battle itself, which I think is a pretty cool revelation. I believe it comes at the Purple Wedding, doesn't it? Or is it right after that when Jaime returns to King's Landing?
Yeah, it's after. I think it's during their little white swords meeting that after he gets back. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's cool. I enjoy that reveal quite a lot, even though it kind of seems like an anticlimax ultimately. And then finally, for foreshadowing Grummer, Tywin promises rewards for Tyrion as befits his service. As it turns out, this turns out to be one of my least favorite subplots / plots for Storm of Swords, and that is the marriage to Sansa Stark and a claim to Winterfell. Of course, this goes really well for Tyrion. They have a happy marriage, and he gets Winterfell, I believe, if I'm remembering A Storm of Swords and A Dance with Dragons correctly.
Somewhere in between the pitch letter and the real text, somewhere in there, he got Winterfell. But of course, instead, things go worse and worse for the Starks over the course of the book. And that brings us to our theory and discussion portion for the episode. And I thought it would be a good idea to just check in terms of where we are with the Red Wedding, because this is a very important chapter for Red Wedding Foreshadowing, and Red Wedding Foreshadowing is something we're going to be talking about a bunch in Storm of Swords. So let's start things off right here. It's funny. Tyrion thinks to himself, a dead enemy. He says out loud to his father in this chapter, a dead enemy is a joy forever. He's thinking about Mandon Moore. He's thinking to himself that the true enemies are on his own side. But without knowing it, he's also describing his father's plans right now, which is to make a dead enemy out of Robb Stark. Tyrion asks Tywin, when are you going to go back into the field? When are you going off to fight Robb or Stannis or someone? And Tywin, he never takes his big, shiny new army into the Riverlands to fight Robb directly. And politically speaking, I'm not sure that he could. The Tyrells are averse to straight fights. And as we'll see in a later Tyrion chapter, they don't really care if the North is independent, under the Greyjoys ideally, but they're not inclined to fight for it. Instead, Tywin has to turn Robb's coalition against itself, first using Roose Bolton to whittle their numbers before unleashing the Freys. As he says, some battles are won with swords and spears, others with quills and ravens. And Duskendale is a prime example of how that works. In the last book, we saw Roose send out Robert Glover and Helmund Tallhart to Duskendale, pretending his orders came from Robb. Tyrion is smart enough to see that this doesn't make any sense. No strategic purpose is served by sending Northmen to the Crown Lands. Even more suspicious on reread is how many details Tywin knows. The names of the Northern commanders, how many men they have. There's really only one person who could have told him that, Roose, with his control of communications from Harrenhal. This is a purge of Stark loyalists, making sure that Roose and his Frey in-laws outnumber Robb when the knives come out at the twins. Nevertheless, as George himself said, Roose keeps his options open all the way. Robert Glover doesn't make it back from Duskendale in time to reveal Roose's treachery to Robb, so potentially Roose could stick with the Starks even after this point if things went awry with the Lannisters. The Freys haven't fully committed to anything yet either. My guess is that Tywin's letter to the twins is informing the Freys of the coming battle at Duskendale, reassuring Walder that their side will have the greater numbers. Maybe his letter to Roose is informing him to leave any other Stark loyalists at the rear of his army when he marches, because we do get those other Stark loyalists who die at the Ruby Ford, although maybe the specifics for that come later. For me, the big question is whether Tywin is in contact with Sibel at this point, whether he's in contact with the Westerlings about arranging that Robb doesn't have an heir. And we'll talk about the more evidence for that in later Catelyn and Jaime chapters. There was plenty of Red Wedding foreshadowing in Clash of Kings that we covered. We talked about Theon's nightmare about it, Dany's vision in the House of the Undying, Roose's schemes that I just mentioned when he sends out Glover and Tallhart. But this chapter is really where it ramps up. And George does such a perfect balancing act of giving us everything we need to figure it out while preventing us on the first time through from actually doing so. Tywin doesn't answer Tyrion's question about his next moves against Robb. He just says, oh yeah, Battle of Duskendale. He doesn't actually answer the question of what are we doing about Robb Stark? And he quickly changes the subject. He's keeping it hidden from Tyrion, and so therefore from us.
I think you were talking about the letters, and boy, would I love to see those letters going back and forth between Tywin, Roose, and Walder Frey, starting at the end of A Clash of Kings, as we saw that one Raven reaching Harrenhal. And I had speculated back then that might have been one of Tywin's opening overtures to Roose Bolton there, and seeing the start of that relationship. The interesting thing about where we're at with the Red Wedding is how, as you were saying, Roose was still not quite committed to it, because as George talked about this right after A Storm of Swords was published, at least the UK version of A Storm of Swords. As for Bolton, if you reread all his sections carefully, I think you will see a picture of a man keeping all his options open as long as he could, sniffing the wind, covering his tracks, ready to jump either way, even as late as his supper with Jaime at Harrenhal. Roos's supper with Jaime at the Harrenhal is significantly later than this point here in A Storm of Swords. And what George seems to be implying is that while negotiations were at work and Roose was actively sending Northmen into harm's way, he still might not have gone through with the Red Wedding. And read a certain way, Roose could have simply been kind of framing this as a way to kill off Stark loyalists to enhance his power in the North, even if he doesn't go through with the Red Wedding. And this is a similar dynamic as we discussed in the Game of Thrones with the Green Fork and what Roose Bolton was doing in sending all of the Stark loyalists into the battle while retaining his own troops and ensuring that they were not killed. But all those dudes, those Manderleys and everyone else who were fighting on behalf of Robb Stark and who actually liked the Starks, yeah, they could all fucking die, but Roose's men are staying behind. But Tywin is not fully read into Roose Bolton's thoughts, and my guess is that Roose was probably telling Tywin that he was committed without truly being committed to the cause here. Still, as we're going to find out in later Tyrion chapters, it's not as if Tywin was really all that committed to Roose Bolton anyways, because Tywin is going to mention that he'll find rewards suitable for Tyrion in this chapter. And as I mentioned earlier, this reward turns out to be Sansa Stark. But the reason why Tywin is planning to wed Tyrion to Sansa is so that he can put a Lannister claimant onto the throne room of Winterfell and name Tyrion as Lord Defender and Lord Protector of the North. And yet, this was part of the price for Roose to turn on Robb. Him being named Lord Protector of Winterfell and Warden of the North, and having Ramsay legitimized and named the Lord of Winterfell. This is such a great dynamic to kind of start A Storm of Swords with as rereaders, because it's wheels within wheels and everyone is plotting betrayal. Even the betrayers plan to betray each other ultimately. It's kind of like a big old welcome to the storm, isn't it?
Exactly. This is definitely the pattern and structure of A Storm of Swords, and that's what makes it so exciting and complicated, as we'll get into at length when you get to that dinner scene between Jaime and Roose is just kind of laying out almost for his own pleasure. Here are all the factions at work, and I'm just going to thread the needle. And it's such exhilarating stuff, even as the content itself is so devastating. It's awesome, and I can't wait to do more of it.
It's so much fun to be back here doing A Storm of Swords with you, man. And for all of the folks who are listening or watching, it's a real joy to have this back in our lives. So it's great. I love it. I'm just re-loving A Song of Ice and Fire and re-loving you more and more every single day doing this with you. So
likewise.
We got to finish with a love fest every single episode, man. So as always, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to those of you who've been watching this episode. If you have the chance, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Podbean, Spotify, anywhere and everywhere where you find our podcasts.
You can check out our Patreon at patreon.com/NotaCastASOIAF. You can follow us on Twitter at NotaCastASOIAF or shoot us an email at NotaCastASOIAF@gmail.com. You can find me at Poor Quentin on Twitter.
And you can find me at Brendan Bfish on Twitter, Brendan Bfish on Reddit, and my website is brendanbfish.substack.com.
We want to shout out and thank our high lords and ladies on Patreon. Red Relu himself, who has renounced his allegiance to the Squishers. Lady of a Thousand Words. Septon Maribald, the Shoeless Sage. Sister Winter, Lady of the Wolfswood. Nessie the Elusive, Warden of the Neck, Defender of the North, and Keeper of Secrets. Sir Thomas the Raven Knight, Lord of Blackwood. Sir Way, of course. Matt, Warden of the Sanguine Shore. Lord Sam K. Wisdom Benjacut, Alchemist of Sets and Quanta, Mage of the Arts of Bulinda Morgan. Tibbs the Great of House Catnapping. Lord J. Manderley, Baker of the Frey Pies. Septon Meriful, Head of Fair. Lady Silverwing. Kaboth the Unfrozen, Lord of the Bricks and Castle Crimson Light. Sir Keith of House Corbray, Wielder of Lady Forlorn. Lord Andrew, Warden of the Dubai Sands. Lord Young of the Ghostwoods. Lady Mira Reed, Wielder of Dark Sister, Slayer of Tinfoil. Sir Will of the Narco-Syndicalist Commune. Lord Clay. Sir Small Paul, Guardian of the Stone Haven, Defender of Dunatar Castle. Septon T-Bone, the Low Septon. Refined Wrangler of Icy Arachnids. Lady Veronica, who has abandoned the orphans at the end of the crossroads to become the Queen of Memes. Lady Danielle of House Lannister. Titanium Pirate. Lady Joan, Lady Ranger of the Frostfangs. Sydney of House Quo, Princess of the Friendly Black Hotties in the Summer Isles. Random, Fierce Protector of Cripples, Bastards, and Broken Things. Sir, Lady, Jordan, Defender of the God's Eye. Lord Peter, not Peter, Drinker of Strong Wine and Lord Commander of the Flat Planetos Society. Lady of Rainy Afternoons, Warden of the Lake. Lady Ken of House Motown, Goddess of Sips and Wine, and Sir Andrew of H-Town. Thank you so much to all our high lords and ladies.
Absolutely. Thank you folks so very much for supporting us every single month. So join us next week for A Storm of Swords Davos 1, in which we check in with the losers of the Battle of the Blackwater. Who cares about them, man? They fucking lost. Fuck them.
Boo! Why do we even have Davos chapters in this book? That's going to be the mood.
Oh, yeah, I think that will be the mood for Davos chapters, right? Man, we get to go from my favorite point of view character to your favorite point of view character in just 2 weeks time frame. So it's a 3 weeks time frame. So it's all really good stuff. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you to all of our patrons again for supporting us. And we'll see you next time for A Storm of Swords, Davos 1.
Excellent.
Oh, yeah.
Mr. Burns, excellent. Thanks for watching, folks. Chat was fire.
Every single
Y'all
time. It always is.
Absolutely.
It's always fun to look at the watch. I'll sometimes glance at the chat. I try not to do it all the time just because it's hard. Sometimes try to keep the place of everything as we're really progressing through. But it's a blast seeing you all and getting into these things and getting into these chapters with us. It's great. So much fun.
Oh, Mackenzie Manderley is asking in the chat, did we skip an Arya chapter? Yes. We're combining the first few Arya chapters in Storm as we did in Clash, but we're doing them a little later because there's, as you'll see when we get into it, there's the chronology thing where Jaime and Brienne go to an inn, and then you see Arya and the Brotherhood at that same inn a little later. And for it to make sense, you have to do the Arya one afterwards. So we're going to be doing Arya 1, 2, and 3 together, I think all around the same time as Arya 2. So we'll get the Jaime 2 first and then do a bunch of Arya chapters together. So that's what we got planned right now.
Yeah, so I mean the Arya chapters, as we found when we were doing a Clash of Kings, the early parts of a Clash of Kings, they tend to. Well, we talked about this last week. I would not shit talk Arya chapters again, but Arya chapters do pick up when we get to the Brotherhood Banners, but we need to get there first. And we figure the easiest way to get there is to combine the first 3 chapters, where we have the Brotherhood Banners showing up in Arya 2, and then we have Harwin showing up at the end of Arya 3. Which is a really good chapter. So yeah, we'll be back with Arya at some point, somewhat soon, after Jaime's second chapter in A Storm of Swords. I'll take a few questions if you're cool with that, man.
Yeah, absolutely. We'll take a couple before we send you on your merry way.
And you as well, sir. And Sir Frank B asks, question: speaking of bad fathers, do you think we'll get Shireen as Stannis' Nissa more in wins? We have to. No.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that has been brought up before is there's the whole Stannis sacrifices the one he loves most to recreate the Azor Ahai Nissa parallel. But then, as a rejoinder, you point out that Stannis and Shireen haven't shared a scene yet in the books, and they made up some I think some solid emotional character scenes for them in the show. I think to kind of fill that gap and to give it kind of a grounding when he chooses to sacrifice her. I think George has been keeping that at bay deliberately, and also maybe just because there's no POV for whom that's really convenient. No one's going to walk in on Stannis in an intimate moment because that's just not his thing. So I do think, though, that we have to at least get one scene with Stannis and Shireen, probably from Melisandre's POV, where they actually talk, because otherwise that is not going to land, I think, effectively. What do you think?
I agree. I think some of the so I think the Nissa story is important for the overall foundation for the Shireen sacrifice, but I don't know that it does a huge amount of it'll probably be brought up again. I'm sure Melisandre will bring it up. I think Stannis is kind of doesn't really care about that sort of stuff, like the chronology and history and background and the mythology associated with that. But I think it's more intended to ground the eventual burning of Shireen within a mystical context, one that it's going to be not sympathetic, but understandable coming from Melisandre's perspective. But Stannis is going, as he always and often is in A Storm of Swords, especially. It's more like I just need to win, so I'm going to win by doing this thing. I have to do the thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I have to do the winning thing. This is a bad thing, I know, but I must justify it because one child against a million is the framing that Stannis uses for these acts. That's typically my perspective on Nissa. Michael asks, is there any explanation in the books as to how brothers of the Night's Watch pay to go digging for gold in Molestown? Sorry to go off topic.
That's a good question. I don't know if I've ever encountered an exact answer to that. Maybe they barter, I guess.
Barter would probably make sense. I mean, you have builders and growers, and you have different things that they can do, right? They They do get coin from the Northern Lords, right? At one point in time,
Well, I
they
mean,
were
'cause
like,
the Night's Watch has to have money to pay for stuff,
yeah,
presumably. So maybe like, if I was in charge of the Night's Watch, I'd probably like set up an account with Molestown and be like, send me the tab, because like, I want to keep my boys a little less agitated, if at all possible. But we don't get any impression they've actually done that. The Night's Watch must have coin. Maybe some brothers steal it.
I mean, that would make sense.
Maybe they're embezzling.
Embezzling from the commander. That would make sense. Yeah, I would say barter prize probably. I feel like I've read some theories that like barter is like the primary way that they exchange for sex work there, but I don't know that for a fact, and I'm not sure that George ever explicitly reveals that in A Song of Ice and Fire. Eric R. asks, if Tywin remarried, which political alliance do you think he would have pursued?
What do you think?
So, which alliance he should have pursued is probably one that would never work, is Dorne. I mean, can you imagine Tywin and Arya in a marriage? I mean, that seems like it seems like a marriage made in hell, but it makes political sense.
I think it could work if they were extremely honest with each other up front. And like agreed to like leave each other alone afterwards, like yes. The ideal Tyrion Sansa relationship.
Right.
But yeah, no, personality wise, that would be a disaster. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I think so. When we get to these later Tyrion chapters, like what Tywin ends up doing though is I don't think it's actually super smart. I mean, in that he ends up trying to marry the Tyrells deeper into the Lannister line. So Joffrey and Marjorie is the one part. And then he tries to get Cersei married to Willis Tyrell later in A Storm of Swords. So he keeps solidifying the Tyrell Lannister parts of the marriage. And of course, the Willis Cersei match doesn't end up working out because Maester Tyrell rejects it. But I don't know. I mean, I would say that Tywin would probably end up in actuality, if he was offering himself up, which of course he never does. He just sends his children forward. He would probably end up marrying into a Reacher family. What do you think, sir?
Yeah, agreed. I mean, it depends when, because there's different people available right after Joanna dies versus now. I don't really. I guess the advantage for another family would be they get in with the Lannisters, but that seems like it would be mostly an advantage to another Westerlands house. Like if I'm House Rowan, like what am I getting exactly? Like, because is Tywin going to make another heir with whoever I'm sending off to marry him? Because otherwise I'm, other than, I guess, more intimate ties with the royal family, which I feel like, I guess that would help if you want to get a leg up on the Tyrells. I could see that working out. I think it would be right after Joanna with the intention of making another heir, I guess would be when Tywin's most attractive as a bridegroom. So, I mean, I guess it's similar to John Connington when Halden says you should marry again. I guess it's kind of similar to that. That's more kind of what we're talking about there, which is interesting.
Of course, Connington he didn't want to marry again for obvious personal reasons. Yeah, as opposed to political ones. But yeah, no, but I think it's a good point. And those Tywin John Con parallels are strong, and I think they'll become even stronger come the Winds of Winter. Maple W asks, what do you think is Bronn's endgame? I think the show's ending was silly, but I do think there is some truth in it, and that he will continue to climb the social ladder, ending the story powerful.
Oh, I totally agree with that. I just think I think he's already there, basically. I think he's going to be very powerful in the Crown Lands specifically, which is not like an area they'd ever developed for the show. So I get why they didn't do that. Putting him in charge of the Reach is a reach. But yeah, no, I totally agree. Like Bronn that's one of the more hilarious things about Feast for Crows is that like in the background, Bronn continues to just climb upward with like having an absurdly easy time of it, apparently.
Right.
And naming his stepson Tyrion just for a laugh. That is something I absolutely love. And yeah, I think that's going to keep going, especially after Tyrion comes back to Westeros.
I think so too. I think Bronn I think we talked about this in an earlier chapter, but Bronn will likely be one of Tyrion's, or potentially one of Dany's allies, since Tyrion is on that track to intersect with Dany in the Winds of Winter, and likely be Hand of the King, a similar Hand of the Queen rather, for what happened as we saw in the show. George did say at one point in time, shortly after A Dance with Dragons was published, that Bronn is going to have a much more prominent role in the Winds of Winter. So I am thinking that Stokeworth and Rosby are places where Bronn might be staking his claim, so to speak. He's already got Castle Stokeworth, as we see at the end of A Feast for Crows. But then Rosby comes up in the A Dance with Dragons epilogue because there is the multiple claims to Castle Rosby.
True, good point.
One of those claims being potentially Rob Squire, whose name is the Frey guy.
Oh, right, Oliver, is that the boy?
Olivia?
Please, sir, I want some more. That one.
The Good Frey.
Frey. What are the handful?
Right, yeah, there's like 5, I think, total. But yeah, so there's potential that Bronn could step into that chaotic mix and seize Rosby for himself. So we'll see what happens with Bronn in the Winds of Winter, but I think he's going to be pretty powerful, and I think his end game is likely going to be probably the most powerful lord in the Crownlands. But yeah, him having Highgarden is really like, come on,
a bit much. That's you kick the older Tyrells out of the show, and then it doesn't make sense for Loras to be in the Kingsguard, but that's well hashed. I think I love the Good Frey thing is also something that's also just becomes funny when you get to Feast and you get to like Jaime's cousin David saying, "Fuck all the Freys, we should murder all of them," except for Perwyn's fine, he can live. But the rest of them are going to kill. And that's so funny because Perwyn is also one of the Freys who was nice to the Starks. So it's like, no matter who's working with the Starks, who's working with the Freys, everyone agrees. There's like 6 good Freys. And the rest can fucking hang. Everyone agrees on that. And I think that's really funny.
Including readers. Readers agree with that too.
Right.
They kind of share
like,
the perspective of
you're okay. The rest of you. It's like fuck you, you're cool, fuck you.
That's brilliant. I love it. Do you have any particular theories as to what George's plan for Tyrek Lannister is? Asks Jake S.
We've talked about this a couple times.
We have. I think so. The basic idea, I think, that we both agree on. We never agree on anything, obviously. So this is one of those rare moments. Is that
right?
Varys likely snatched Tyrek Lannister up during the chaos of the Bread Riot back from a Clash of Kings, and that he's likely going to use him as a means of enhancing Aegon's power, Young Griff's power, when he arrives in Westeros. And there's a potential that one theory that I'm particularly fond of is the idea that he'll have Tyrek as the as the government in a box, so to speak. So he'll have him as like the Lord Paramount of the Westerlands. Like, I've got a Lannister too. I've got Tyrek Lannister. He is the new Lord Paramount of the Westerlands, Warden of the West, so to speak, as to kind of supplant the Lancers who are allied with the Tyrells by the end of A Dance with Dragons. So yeah, that's kind of what are our thoughts. Is there anything else about Tyrek that we might find out in the Winds of Winter or whatnot?
Right, I guess the theories have ranged from him being a witness against Cersei to him being an heir to the Westerlands. I'm curious as to how that intersects with Tyrion's arc specifically, and what Varys has in mind, but then there's what George has in mind. So I am curious about that because Tyrek's been off page for a while. We never established a personality for him, so I'm curious if he gets any scenes, if he's involved in the Lannister downfall. But he might just be Varys pulling out right out of his pocket, I'm sure, is what he has in mind for him.
Yeah, it's going to be exciting to see. And George has said that Tyrek will return. We will find out the fate of Tyrek Lannister. He said this back in like 1998, and that still is not quite come into focus in the books, but that is something that he is planning for an eventual reveal for the Winds of Winter, or Dreamspring, I guess, could be the case as well. Maester Mary of the Learned Hands podcast, and thank you, by the way. I just finally listened to your episode about the Hornwood inheritance, and you did shout me out there and say you did the episode for me, so thank you very much. That was very meaningful. Thank you. Ask, have you all discussed which book had your favorite / the best Tyrion chapters? So the best Tyrion chapters.
That's hard. What do you think?
I mean, the Clash has the best political chapters, but I think Dance has the best Tyrion chapters. At least the early part of Dance, I think, are my. I don't know if they're favorite chapters, but Tyrion 6 from A Dance with Dragons is one of the most gut-wrenching, terrible chapters in terms of like what Tyrion is going through. But at the same time, it's a really good chapter that lays bare the emptiness and nihilism that Tyrion has embraced as a result of killing a version of himself. Not the mirror images, yes, you were talking about in the episode itself, but the part of Tyrion that he can identify with in killing his father, and that leads to the multiple rapes that Tyrion commits on the sex worker and so Horus. And of course, the chapter ends with the with Jorah Mormont seizing Tyrion Lannister and taking him to the Queen, which of course turns out not to be Cersei, but is Daenerys Targaryen. As we come to find out later Dany chapters or later Tyrion chapters. What do you think? What are your favorite / best Tyrion chapters in the story?
I think they all have their own kind of strengths to them. I think you get a lot of fun, snarky dialogues with scenes with him in the first book. You get a lot of great political manipulation scenes in the second. And this book in Storm, I think, is the most heightened emotions, the biggest drama. And in Dance is interesting because Dance is where you get the sense like, oh, Tyrion's been holding back, and this kind of is who he actually is. And there's a real catharsis to that in realizing how much George was kind of dancing around Tyrion's villainous qualities and then giving them to you unfiltered. And it's less of a swing than with Theon. You know what I mean? Like that's a huge leap that George makes to bring you along to this totally new place a character was in, so you have to recalibrate. With Tyrion, it's more subtle, and I like that kind of rug pull where George traps you in Tyrion's head and makes you hang out with him for a while. And in the middle of his stuff in Dance is really good, but I do understand why people drop off that because it doesn't really end. Like he just gets to the Marine and then the book is over. So it doesn't like, a strong character arc feels like it should wrap up in some way that sums it all up. And his Clash and Storm ones have that, especially Storm Dance does not. So I think that there's not one that's really a big champ for me. I think they all have their interesting strengths and weaknesses.
Agreed. Yeah, I like Tyrion's chapters a lot. We were talking about that in our episode for our two highest patron tiers. How Tyrion's chapters sometimes get, because he's such a good point of view character, there's this sense of like, oh, he's actually not good at all. In fact, the best point of view character in all of A Song of Ice and Fire is Sir Aerys Oakheart, but yeah, Tyrion's chapters are all really, really good. George writes them with quite a bit of aplomb, although the next Tyrion chapter in Storm is not amazing, but that's okay. The rest of them more than make up for that one. Pedro asks, is Sir Ilan Payne Jaime's private monster like Tyrion with Bronn, Cersei with the Kettle Blacks, and Sir Robert Strong and Tywin with all his mad dogs? Interesting idea about Ilan Payne being Jaime's monster, because you need the monsters, as this chapter talks about, you need monsters from time to time. Is this what's going on for Sir Ilan Payne when they link up in A Feast for Crows? I don't think so. I could be
misremembering, but Jaime doesn't have Ilan Payne do anything monstrous, does he?
No. He just uses him to threaten him at one point in time, like he does the...
Oh, right. Yeah. With the phrase, or...
I can't remember if it's with the phrase where he's like, how many strokes do you think it would take to... Yeah, it's...
Right. Well, he threatens to use Ilan Payne to execute Edmure, right?
Yes.
And then Ilan Payne just cuts the rope. So yeah, no, I mean, Ilan Payne is mostly there. I think it's just Jaime wants someone to talk to, and also he wants someone to fight with who won't reveal how shitty Jaime is at fighting.
Right.
So I think that's more, in a way that it's more like a twisted mirror of Brienne and Podrick, the other Payne, with like Ilan as Jaime's like sidekick / not squire, but like his second in command person. Only it's a much sadder relationship than Brienne and Pod. So no, Jaime. That's what starts to get interesting about Jaime in later chapters, is that Jaime's not really, he's not really much of a commander in that he doesn't seem to think about his subordinates very strongly. And so he doesn't really have a crew. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
He doesn't have a gang, Jaime. So I don't think it quite operates that way. Like Ramsay has the Bastards Boys, and Jaime doesn't have anything like that.
I think you're right. But that might be ultimately just Jaime's detriment, because when, Brienne shows up at the end of his final and only chapter in A Dance with Dragons, it's basically like he just rolls off with her. He doesn't really have anyone to be like, hey, wait, maybe you shouldn't do this. Maybe you should think about this. He just rides off because he's got no one besides Hoster Blackwood hanging out with him, and some like random Lannister dudes that aren't really his friends. Mm-hmm. Jaime's kind of doesn't have a whole lot of friends, as we come to find out in the book. Of A Storm of Swords, and definitely when we get to A Feast for Crows too. Let's see here. Take maybe one or two more.
Sure, that works for me.
Alan asks, what do you think will be the end of Senator Clegane in the books? A peaceful life on the Quiet Isle, or will he unfortunately revert back to a life of violence and end up dying?
I don't think he's staying on the Quiet Isle long term. I I don't know if it's going to be full on the situation we saw in the show, but I do think there is some kind of cathartic moment for Sandor to come in terms of dealing what was done to him by his brother. And I do kind of doubt he lasts beyond the scope of the series. But I'm interested to see how it plays out in the POV structure, because he can't just hang out with the Brotherhood like he does in the show. So I'm very curious to see if and when he reunites with the Stark sisters. I think that for me, that's what I'm waiting for more than his eventual fate, as I want him to talk to Sansa and Arya again, and for them to reckon with how they've all changed.
Yeah, it's I'm with you. I don't think he stays on the Quiet Isle. I think some of the show's dynamic was a little bit silly, in terms of like him just like rolling out and then just starting to go murder crazy again. But I do think there's a dynamic that will exist. I really hope that he does link up with the Brother Without Banners, because I think that would be in the show's later seasons, as much criticism as it rightfully earned and then extended to the show's later seasons. I do think that the Sandor, Clegane, Beric Dondarrion relationship and the Thoros and Myr relationship was actually pretty good. I liked a lot of that. I think one of the most affecting scenes from one of the later seasons is where they're burying the family of the people that Sandor Clegane had basically condemned to death back in the day. That's a really moving scene from season 7. And I do think it works well with Sandor Clegane's arc of him moving beyond simply being a silent gravedigger to being also not being into the murder as much, and having like a cause in the form of the Brother Without Banners, and seeking after Sansa Stark up in Winterfell. I think those are ways that works out. But I think ultimately, I do see the potential. This is I'm not a Clegane Bowl type guy, but I do see that as being some sort of confrontation between the two ultimately, and that might be the way that Sandor goes out. They both go out at the same time. Probably not in similar lenses seen in the show with them, King's Landing burning, and then them fighting each other to the death, but potentially as something else, and maybe Sansa Stark could be involved in that, as I think Chloe has been theorizing about for some time now. So I think that's a way that ends up playing out in the books. Let's see here. Take one more question.
Sure.
And I'll go to Sir Frank B, who asked, second Stannis fatherhood question. Man, Frank asking about Stannis. Is this in character? Is this in character? I don't know. If Shireen had been a boy, does that mellow Stannis out, or just make him even more maniacal in seeking the Iron Throne / paternal love from Robert? So we're gender swapping Shireen to being a boy. So how does that impact Stannis? What's the type of character that he becomes thereafter?
I guess it depends on the personality of the son. If the son is like Stannis, I think maybe he'd have like a project, and maybe that would focus him a bit.
A project.
But here's my concern, is that the son comes out like looking like Robert or Renly.
Oh, jeez.
And is like a perfect charismatic child, and everyone loves him and hates. Like, that's what I would be worried about / find hysterical. Because as we'll get into the Davos chapters later in the book, Edric Storm is just this hilarious joke on Stannis, where even the bastard in the family looks and sounds and talks better, and everyone likes him more than Stannis. Still. So that's great. So I would love that. We've compared Tywin and Stannis to each other before, and I was, this scene from Tyrion's first chapter has Tywin saying, rights give customs give you the right to bear my father's sigil for House Lannister, even though because I cannot prove that you are not mine. And what I'm thinking is, in my mind, of Stannis being like, is this son of mine actually my son? Or is he like, or did Robert did Robert fuck Selyse? Is that what happened here? And right.
Now I've got a son that looks like Robert Baratheon. Is that what's happening here?
That would be hysterical. It's amazing. So again, that's just there's comedy gold with Stannis and all his dynamics, because everything just makes everything worse all the time. And it's just like we'll get to in his moment of his biggest triumph, coming to the wall, everyone's cheering his name, and even then Jon thinks, "Oh, Robert's here, I guess." Even then, when Robert's dead, still, it's just great.
Cannot escape the shadow of his brother. He's always lived with it, always lived in the cold, where his brother got the sunlight. Yeah,
exactly, right from the start.
I think that would be great. So, folks, thank you so much for watching and participating a little in these these Knack After Dark things. We enjoy doing them with you, and it's a lot of fun, and it's fun to be doing these live streams with you all every single week, and we are looking forward to continuing these going forward. It's great.
Me too. Yeah, I love it every week. Thanks so much for coming out, folks.
All right. So again, next week we'll be back for I keep like trying to say I have to consciously make the decision to say a Storm of Swords instead of a Clash of Kings because we said it so much.
It looks wrong. There's supposed to be a C right there. Yeah.
Right. It's like yeah. So join us next week for a Storm of Swords Davos 1, which of course will be at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for our live stream, and we'll look forward to seeing you then.
Take care, folks.